Hello and welcome to Wednesday's lecture. In this first part of our lecture today, your objectives are to explain the importance of decomposition to nutrient cycling, to describe abiotic factors that affect the rate of decomposition, to define biogeochemical cycle, and then identify the biological importance, forms available to life, major reservoirs, and key processes in four cycles, three cycles, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. I'll also show you the phosphorus cycle, but we won't focus on that one as much. So our topic, at least for this first part of the lecture, is all about nutrient cycling. And so we already know, or we already covered several times this semester, that energy flows through ecosystems in a one-way flow. So energy comes from the sun, it gets absorbed by primary producers in the process of photosynthesis. That solar energy gets converted to chemical energy, which gets passed on to the primary consumers, the herbivores, and then they process that energy, and then they pass energy as well as molecules onto the secondary and tertiary consumers. And when any of these animals die, materials get transferred to, they end up as detritus, which then gets decomposed by microorganisms and other detritivores. So we've got the energy flowing through, and notice that at each step along the way, some energy is lost as heat. And so last time we talked about the rule of 10, how each trophic level only has available about 10% of what the trophic level underneath it was able to capture and store as chemical energy. So, so we want to focus in now on these detritivores and microorganisms, these decomposers. And so why is decomposition so important to nutrient cycling? So I was just focusing on the energy flow piece. Now we want to look more at the chemical cycling and how this works, and why decomposition is so important to nutrient cycling. So pause the video for a moment and formulate an answer to this question. Why is decomposition so important to nutrient cycling? Well, clearly, if it weren't for these microorganisms and other detritivores that are decomposing dead and decaying material, or detritus, if it weren't for these decomposers, then a lot of these nutrients, we see these arrows coming out, and the biggest arrow should probably just be going back to the primary producers, because secondary and tertiary consumers, I guess some of them might eat the detritus. There are some scavenging animals that are kind of top carnivores. So eagles will eat roadkill. They don't always just eat fresh killed animals. But mostly when these decomposers decompose, what they're doing is they are breaking down the material that's in this detritus, and they are using cellular respiration to release the carbon in the form of CO2, and that's the main material that is taken in by the primary producers. Also, these microorganisms liberate any mineral nutrients, iron, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, nitrogen, and those are going to go into the soil, and the soil is going to end up being taken up by the plants as well. So this arrow could be carbon, it could also be nitrogen, could be pretty much any kind of a nutrient that ends up going back to the primary producers. So if this didn't happen, if we didn't have decomposition, we would all be walking on just piles and piles of dead plants and animals. Wouldn't that be lovely? So decomposition is hugely important. It keeps the nutrient cycling, and that is necessary for life on Earth. So what abiotic factors affect decomposition rates? What do you think? What abiotic factors are going to affect how fast something decomposes? Think of a place in the world where decomposition would be fast. Think of a place where decomposition would be really slow. And probably you're thinking, well, the warmer it is, the more decomposition you're going to have. And that's true. And also moisture is important. So if it's warm and wet, you're going to have fast decomposition. And so think of a tropical rainforest. When I was in college at the University of Wyoming, one of my professors was a landscape ecologist. And well, I guess he was more of a plant, what's the word, a plant ecosystem ecologist. I took a course from him called vegetation ecology. And he, when he was in grad school himself, his research was in the tropics. And he told us that one time they went and they marked a number of trees in the tropical rainforest, and they came back 10 years later to see how much they had grown. And there were a few trees that they couldn't find, and they couldn't figure it out. Like they knew like exactly where they were. They had marked them and mapped them very carefully. But when they came back, they couldn't find them. And they kind of scruffed away a little bit and in the soil and found like little bits of decomposed wood. And they realized that these trees had not only fallen down, but they had completely decomposed in that 10-year period of time. And this was kind of just really impressive to me, because in Wyoming, it's dry and it can be cold. And we went up into the mountains and looked at the forests there, and we saw trees that had been laying on the ground, and they'll lie there for maybe 50, 60, up to 100 years before they're completely decomposed. So hot, wet places, you're going to have really rapid decomposition. And in contrast, cold, dry places, it's going to be really slow. And then another important characteristic is the availability of oxygen. So if you don't have very much oxygen, then you can't do cellular respiration. And decomposers are doing cellular respiration just like we are. They're using oxygen as a final electron acceptor in their mitochondria, and they're using that oxygen to decompose. So if you don't have much oxygen, there's not going to be much decomposition. And so I'll give you a story about that too. You all know about Lake Superior, which is a very deep lake, which means that down at the bottom of that lake, it's very cold. It's always very cold at the bottom of the lake. It's probably about 40 degrees Fahrenheit at the bottom of the lake year round. And it's also, there's not very much oxygen down there. And so because of those two factors, there are some shipwrecks that happened like 100 years ago. And if you dive deep down to get to those shipwrecks, which I'm not a diver, so that gives me the heebie-jeebies kind of. But if people that do dive all the way down to those ships, there's one where there are still some bodies of sailors inside the ship's cabins. And one in particular, there's like on the bridge where the officers are, there's like 3 officers' bodies that are still in the bridge. And they have kind of decomposed a little bit, but mostly they're intact. I understand it's kind of weird. Okay, so let's look at this graph and what's going on in this graph. Notice what's on the x-axis is mean annual temperature, and then notice what's on the y-axis is the percent of mass lost. And so we're talking about the detritus or the litter on the floor of a forest or some other kind of ecosystem. You can see that this study, which was done in Canada, looked at all different kinds of ecosystems. Subarctic boreal, boreal would be coniferous forest, northern coniferous forest, temperate grassland mountain, and the temperate would be a temperate forest like what we have around here. And so the percent of mass lost would be how much decomposition happens. So if you take that litter and then you weigh the litter and see how much mass it lost. How does it lose that mass? Again, it loses that mass by cellular respiration. It's releasing carbon into the atmosphere as CO2. So, so what's going on here? The higher the temperature, the more mass was lost. So the higher the temperature, you can see there's a good correlation between temperature and how much mass. And look especially in the mountain, and you can see that the temperature, the amount of decomposition just follows the temperature. It's a little bit less close of a relationship with the boreal, but everything taken together, the amount of decomposition follows temperature. And here's another example of cold temperatures having low decomposition. This is a baby horse, a foal, that was found in Siberia in permafrost. I think it was like I can't remember. I saw this article just recently. I think it was just a couple of years ago. They found this baby horse, and it was so well preserved in the permafrost that they were able to extract some liquid blood from it. Isn't that amazing? So even though it had been there for 42,000 years, they think about it, even if it's been there for 100 years, you wouldn't expect it to have any liquid blood. So, I mean, even if you're a young Earth creationist and you think the Earth is only 6,000 years old, it's still amazing that they found this liquid blood in this baby horse. Okay, so now that we've talked about decomposition, we want to talk about the biogeochemical cycles, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, which we've already talked about quite a bit, and the nitrogen cycle, which we've talked about a little bit in the context of plant nutrition. So let's get into this a little bit. What is a biogeochemical cycle? Let's break down this word a little bit. Bio means life. So a biogeochemical cycle has chemicals that are spending part of their time in living things, and then geo means earth, and so part of their time in non-living things, could be in the soil or in the atmosphere. So a biogeochemical cycle involves both living and non-living components of ecosystems. Biotic would be living. Abiotic is non-living components of ecosystems. So biotic would be mostly plants and animals, but don't forget the microorganisms, the decomposers, don't forget the fungi, because they are also super important in these biogeochemical cycles. And then abiotic components would be soil, air, and also water. Every biogeochemical cycle includes reservoirs, which are where these chemicals are being held for a period of time. And these reservoirs can be either living or non-living. So often the atmosphere is a big reservoir. And then processes which would move chemicals from one reservoir to another reservoir. There would have to be a process that would be involved in making that transition. So here, for example, is just a generic biogeochemical cycle. And there are 4 reservoirs shown here, A, B, C, D. And then there are several processes. So for example, reservoir A here is composed of living organisms and detritus. And so the chemicals that are here are in an organic form. They'd be tied up with carbon compounds, and they would be available to be moved around. So they could move into reservoir C, which is inorganic and available, by either respiration or decomposition or excretion, these processes that living things do that move materials into the air and into the water or into the soil. And these would be, in Reservoir C, you would have inorganic materials, but they would still be available for cycling. Or from these living organisms reservoir, you can have waterlogging and fossilization that would put nutrients into deep soil reservoirs or deep into rock, and they would be unavailable for cycling unless there is some sort of human activity that releases them, like we drill oil and coal and peat, and that releases organic material that otherwise would be unavailable for cycling. And then let's go back over here to Reservoir C. So nutrients that are in Reservoir C can go back into living things by nutrient uptake or photosynthesis, or these nutrients can be formed into sedimentary rock. And in this case, you would have inorganic, unavailable nutrients. And these can be made available by weathering and erosion. So, so this is kind of in general how a biogeochemical process works. So I want you to be able to draw models of the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle. Again, I'll show you the phosphorus cycle, but I won't test you over that. So when you are looking at these cycles, you need to recognize what are the main reservoirs, what are the key processes that are involved in the cycling, and then what forms of these nutrients would be available to living organisms. So, so on your next exam, it's likely that I will choose one or more of these cycles and I will ask you to draw it and explain the main reservoirs, key processes, forms available to life. And so what I'll do is I'll spend the next few minutes going through these main ones, and then I will give you some lecture quiz questions about how they work. So let's start with the water cycle. You've likely been learning about the water cycle ever since you were, I don't know, 3rd or 4th grade, probably. You've been learning about how water cycles. And so we know a lot about lakes, so let's start with lakes. So water that is in lakes can either evaporate into the atmosphere, or it could run off and go into groundwater or go into the ocean. Water in the ocean can then evaporate and go back into the air. So what you're seeing here is the reservoirs would be the atmosphere. Another reservoir would be freshwater, lakes and rivers. Another reservoir would be groundwater, which is water stored in the ground. Another reservoir would be the oceans. And then processes are shown with the arrows. So main process for moving water from the atmosphere to the ground is precipitation. And as I'm sure you know, precipitation can be rain, sleet, snow, hail, all different kinds of precipitation. So water has to condense into droplets in the clouds, and then that condensed water has to fall down as precipitation. Once it lands, it can percolate through the soil. So percolation is another process that would move water from the surface down into the groundwater, or it can run off. So another process is runoff, which moves water into the oceans. And then from the oceans, again, you can have evaporation. So evaporation and transpiration, which is evaporation from plants, are the main processes that return water to the atmosphere. And then water in the atmosphere can be moved over land or moved away from land by wind. So we learned about, well, maybe we didn't learn about convection in this class, but movement by wind can move clouds and move moisture. So those are main reservoirs and processes with the water cycle. Notice that in the water cycle, the water stays as water. It might change states. It might change from water vapor into liquid or solid water as it falls. A lake might freeze, but it's always going to be water. In the other cycles that we're going to look at, the form, the molecule that holds the nutrient can change, but in the water cycle, it's always going to be water. And so the main forms that are available to living things are water, liquid water. Okay, let's look at the carbon cycle. We've already spent some time talking about the carbon cycle, and so we already understand a lot of the details about how carbon moves through ecosystems. So let's start with the reservoirs. The main reservoirs are, again, the atmosphere. There's a big reservoir of carbon in living things, especially plants, but also in consumers. And then there is a reservoir of carbon in living things that are in the oceans. And then also there is carbon in some compounds that sink to the bottom of the ocean or get deposited in the ground. So let's talk about the processes. So photosynthesis, we spent some time talking about photosynthesis. In the Calvin cycle of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide gets fixed into organic molecules. So a main form of carbon that's available for plants is CO2. And that's the only place they get carbon is by doing photosynthesis and taking carbon in. They don't get sugar from the soil or from any place else. That's the main way plants get carbon. Then animals get their carbon by eating either plants or eating other animals. And so the form of carbon that is available to animals would be organic compounds like carbohydrates, proteins, lipids. That would be the form of stored carbon that is going to be passed on through the food chain. And then as each one of these organisms, the plants, the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, as all of them do cellular respiration, and I hope you are convinced by now that plants do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. This process releases CO2 back to the atmosphere. Notice that there's also going to be photosynthesis in lakes and in aquatic ecosystems. So this could be a lake or it could be an ocean. So there are phytoplankton, small organisms on the surface of the ocean that perform photosynthesis and store carbon as sugars and other more complicated organic molecules. And then these phytoplanktons are eaten by zooplanktons or by larger consumers. And when these fish die and decompose, well, first of all, they do cellular respiration and return some CO2 to the atmosphere that way. But if they die and decompose, the carbon in their bodies can become part of some carboniferous deposits, such as calcium carbonate, or such as coal or oil or peat. And so these would be different forms of carbon that would be stored in the soil. And peat and all of these are pretty much inaccessible to living organisms. So the main forms that are available to living organisms would be CO2 being available to the plants, and then organic molecules that are eaten by the consumers. And then many of these biogeochemical cycles are affected by humans. So what's the main thing humans do that affects this biogeochemical cycle is that we burn wood, which releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and it reduces the number of producers that are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. and we burn fossil fuels. So when we burn fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, we're taking an otherwise inaccessible form of this carbon and we are releasing it out to the atmosphere. So that really changes this whole carbon cycle. And the result is that we have more and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because we are releasing more from the soil than our producers are able to take in by photosynthesis. So that's a carbon cycle. Next is the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle, let's start with the reservoirs. Again, the atmosphere is a huge reservoir of nitrogen. There's nitrogen in living organisms, plants and animals, and then there's going to be dissolved organic nitrogen in the ocean. There's also going to be some organic or some nitrogen compounds that are in the soil, and we'll zoom in on that a little bit. And then there could be some stored in rocks as well. So now let's look at the processes. So let's focus in down here on the soil. This is what we learned about in the chapter when we learned about plant nutrition. We learned about the nitrogen cycle and how the nitrogen cycle depends on these various kinds of bacteria. Nitrogen fixing bacteria that fix nitrogen into ammonium, different kinds of bacteria that perform decomposition, ammonifying bacteria. I think the ammonification actually goes with this arrow that's connecting the fungi down to here. And then nitrification that converts ammonium ions into nitrites and nitrates. And then plants, you will remember, can either absorb ammonium ions or plants can absorb nitrate ions. And really this arrow here that says uptake of amino acids, I don't know what that's about because plants do not take amino acids out of the soil. So I really think that we should just cross that out. So I'm gonna cross this out. This should not be here, but maybe that is what this arrow is. This is amino acids that would be taken from the plant into the consumer. So that's what this arrow is. It's not this one. Maybe here's what I'll do. I will erase this one and then I will draw an arrow from here to here. That's what this arrow is. This is uptake of amino acids. That's not this arrow here. Okay, so plants are able to take in nitrogen in the form of either nitrates or ammonium. And we had more detail on this in the chapter on plant nutrition, where we went into much more detail on the nitrogen cycle. So this is just kind of a simplification of the nitrogen cycle, but some of these processes are important. Notice that nitrogen does not have to get into plants and animals to complete its cycle. It can go from the atmosphere, it can be fixed by bacteria, it can be ammonified, and it can be then nitrified to turn into nitrates, and then denitrification can happen with other bacteria, and that'll return that nitrogen back to the air. So, so it doesn't have to go through plants and animals. Now let's look at some of these other processes. So we see that we've also got runoff. So when farmers are putting down a nitrogen fertilizer, nitrogen is a very common limiting nutrient. So when a farmer puts nitrogen into their field, sometimes that nitrate can run off with water into the ocean or into some other body of water. So there can be nitrogen in various forms in the water. It can be either in the form of nitrates or it can be in the form of ammonia or ammonium ions. And also, I wanted to point out that lightning can fix nitrogen, can convert nitrogen from into nitrate. And then there is some cycling within living organisms in the ocean. And then again, we have decomposition and sedimentation that can store nitrogen in the soil. Now let's look again at how humans are affecting the nitrogen cycle. And the big way we are doing this is by making fertilizers. So we use factories to take nitrogen out of the air, and we use a process called industrial fixation, which makes nitrogen into a form that we can put onto our fields. Probably the most common form of fertilizer that is used is anhydrous ammonia, so NH3 in that form. And these factories are, they affect the environment in a couple of different ways. They affect the nitrogen cycle by adding a lot of nitrogen to fields that can then run off and go into lakes. And they also use a lot of fossil fuels, a lot of energy to run them, and they produce some reactive nitrogen gases like nitrous oxide that can be a form of air pollution. And we'll talk about more about this in the next chapter, more about the various human impacts on these biogeochemical cycles. Okay, so last is the phosphorus cycle, and I won't spend very much time on this, but the phosphorus cycle, there's not a lot of phosphorus in the atmosphere, so the atmosphere is not a big reservoir, but you can see that phosphorus can get into the atmosphere as wind-blown dust. But mostly phosphorus is in soil and water and in rocks. And so plants, as you know, need phosphorus, and animals need phosphorus. And so the way phosphorus goes through living organisms is it's taken up through the roots in the form of phosphates. And then the plants incorporate that phosphorus into ATP, nucleic acids, probably some other things, but phospholipids, that's the other big thing I was trying to remember. And then when the animals eat the plants, then they're able to incorporate the phosphorus into their bodies in those forms. Then when either plants or animals die and decompose, then the phosphorus can be returned to the soil in the form of phosphate. If it leaches into the oceans, then it can fertilize plankton. And so either nitrogen running off or phosphate running off into an ocean, as we saw last time, can cause a bloom of algae. And then you can also get sedimentation, and so the phosphorus can get stored in rocks, which can be exposed by geological uplift, and then you can have weathering and erosion that then releases those nutrients so that they're in the soil or water, or so that they get up into the atmosphere and then come to the earth by precipitation. So that's the phosphorus cycle. So we'll stop there. This has been kind of a long video, and then I will ask you some quiz questions about what we've covered so far.